Sure.
Hey guys, welcome to Elite Sports University. Hey, I'm Coach Hofman today, and I have the great honor and privilege to be talking to one of our colleagues and friends down under, Dr. Rob Orr. How you doing today, Doc?
Having a ball. How you doing, Coach?
Not too bad here. It's getting a little warm, but it's doing well, actually. But I do want to thank you for taking the time. I know it's been a pain in the butt here trying to schedule everything, especially seeing that we're on the opposite sides of the world. So thanks for taking the time to speak with us today.
For you, always welcome, mate.
So how about you give our listeners a little bit of background on yourself? I know you can do it a lot better than I can, because if I did it, my goodness, I think I might blow your head up a little bit too much. So give our listeners a little bit of background on your expertise and field of tactical training.
Sure. So I joined the Army at the age of 17, and I went into infantry. I then transferred across to the physical training instructor stream. So in the Australian Defence Force, we train our own physical trainers. And I worked as a physical training instructor in the Australian Army for about 10 years before the military sent me away to do my physiotherapy, or what you call physical therapy degree, where I worked as a clinical physiotherapist for the military in uniform. And I finished off my full-time service in the military as a human performance officer for Special Operations Command. I now continue to do a lot of reserve work for them. I've come across to Bond University, where I teach on the Doctor of Physiotherapy program. And I've also set up the Tactical Research Unit with my co-lead, Dr. Rob Orr, where our current research is with a variety of military, law enforcement, and firefighter populations, looking at everything from their initial entry standards to ultimate selection into specialist categories and their rehabilitation return to work, as a quick summary.
So, you do a lot of work with law enforcement and fire and military. What do you find similar and what do you find different just in their environment? Like in terms of working with them, are they the same? Should we categorize them all the same? Should we approach them in the same way?
I think the thing that makes them unique are some of the similarities, like their mindsets. 9 times out of 10 people don't go into the military and they don't go into law enforcement or fire for their own gain. They go in there because they want to provide a service and they always want to serve the community. I think that's an important point and a mindset that they have, and that actually leads to a lot of problems. Like, they'll always put everybody else first and they tend to put themselves last, which they tend to end up with injuries, and they just crack on and do the job, whereas the average person would say, I'm hurt, I'm going to stop. Yeah. So quite often their injuries and their severity of their injuries are a lot higher than you get in your general workplace. The similarities, they all carry load. Yes, the load will be different. The context of the load in which they carry will be different, and the environment they carry the load will be different. But ultimately, they're always carrying load. They're always in situations, or potentially in situations, that are life-threatening, where they have to make informed decisions very, very quickly, and the results, if they get it wrong, can be catastrophic. And with the advent of things like, personal cameras, mobile phones, they're now incredibly scrutinized for every decision they make in an instant, which then can be sat back by the general public and dissected over an 18-month period by armchair experts. So the working environment of these populations can be very, very similar in terms of stress, physiological workload, and even mindset. But there are some subtle differences, even within individual law enforcement agencies. So, as we've had a bit of a chat with offline, the unions are very different across different law enforcement populations around the world. And likewise, some tactical organizations, like the military, they don't have a union. So there are some of those small nuances in the politics of how we try to get things implemented and pushed through that can be very challenging and also very unique to individual agencies.
That is actually probably one of the best definitions or answers I've ever heard in terms of how they are actually similar. I actually just learned something that was brilliant, actually, Rob. All carry loads, all life-threatening. They all want to serve, and a lot of young coaches starting out, they don't understand how valuable that little bit of information is in terms of actually going out and helping these tactical athletes. So what do you guys do? How long has Bond University been doing this? You guys have so much work. You guys have so many studies. You're probably ahead of the curve than 90% of anybody else out there. How did you guys start involved in this tactical field, and take us through that?
So I was lucky enough to have one of my long-time mentors, and the actual the person who mentored me through my PhD, Dr. Rod Pope, moved to Bond University. Now, he was a physiotherapist for the military, and he helped them set up their defense injury prevention programs. The actual fitness standards that we now use for the Australian Army actually came from his work. So he's been a long-time mentor of mine, and we got together, and then we started working with people like Sergeant McSteely from the New South Wales Police, Inspector Richard Gorey from the Queensland Fire and Rescue, and we started to realise that there are some common trends across these populations. And then we brought in people like Shane Irving and Jeremy Roberts from the Australian Federal Police, and we started to say, you know, the problems that a lot of these organisations are facing are very similar, both in terms of challenges of implementing physical conditioning, like being very time poor, like the fact that, you know, everything else always takes priority over physical fitness. And at the same time, similarities in things like the requirement to carry load. So we started saying, well, you know, there's a lot of similarities across these populations, but quite often their work, because they're so focused on their mission, is stovepiped. So they look at how to do their processes better, often not realizing that what they're learning can transcend to other services. So we sat down together and we said, well, how can we improve this? Let's start with knowledge sharing. And we set up the Tactical Research Unit, and we started reaching out to specialists around the world. And we got them to join us from across a variety of different populations, from both academics, so people who have done the research in this field, but more importantly for us, I think, practitioners. So, you know, police officers who have served on the ground, personnel who have served in the military, personnel who have served in fire and rescue. Because one thing we have noticed is quite often that the research is great, but it never actually gets to that implementation where the rubber meets the road, breaks down. So if we could have everybody in the same room across multiple organizations talking about this, hopefully we could kick some big goals.
That is very wise. The whole idea of having a practitioner, you know, how many times we hear here in the States, at least, the studies, but it's so hard to actually practically apply some of these studies because you have so much interference, like you said, the unions, the political landscape, and these other issues. So, you know, sometimes they're a little cautious in measuring heart rate variabilities and actually prying into these areas. So, you know, how do you take this research that's being done out there and apply it to those on the ground is a challenging thing.
It is indeed. So we try to come at it from two approaches. One is what we call the top-down approach. So we try to sell it to the hierarchy, but we found it's also very effective to do a bottom-up approach. You get the practitioners on the ground, and this is something I know you advocate for very strongly as well, is they become your champions. You know, and when they become your champions, it sells itself. And they're really, to be honest, they're the people we're trying to help, which is why they become the champions, more than the bureaucracy up top. We're trying to help the end user. So quite often they are such strong advocates of it. So if we can approach it from both ends, hopefully we meet in the middle and we get some change.
It really is. It's the power in numbers. You know, that there's something to be said about having these foot soldiers on your side, buying into it. Sometimes it's an easier victory once you get them to buy in, whereas those above, the chiefs and so on, if they see it's working and they see it benefits them, and it's going to, I guess, say there will be less obstacles for the chief to overcome, they become more supportive.
Indeed. I agree with you 100%.
So one of the big areas that always comes up is this extreme conditioning program. I'd probably say about 5 years ago, it was really the hot topic. Here in the States, it's kind of phasing out a little bit, but it's still there. You know, give us your idea or your point of view of this extreme conditioning program that everybody always wants to do.
Look, the reality is extreme conditioning programs have always been around. The irony is some of the programs that are out there, we used to do in the gym, under the PTIs, our physical training instructors all the time. But the difference was we never used to do them every day. And we also used to be trained up to the point where we knew whether or not it was appropriate to apply this form of conditioning. I think the biggest concern at the moment is this one-size-fits-no-one approach, where you'll have a workout that everybody is going to do regardless of fitness level, regardless of skill level, regardless of what they have going on before or after. And that raises a concern because quite often if you're pushing everybody all the time to their limit, there is no recovery. And we all know that recovery for these people is vital. I'd say, more important than the actual conditioning is their optimized recovery, because that is something we do not focus on. And that is something so important that they have to learn how to manage, because quite often they'll be bouncing from one task to another. So they have to optimize their recovery in the beginning phase of it. And likewise, what are we trying to achieve? A lot of people forget what we're trying to achieve with this conditioning. You know, is it so that you can do more snatches more quickly? Or is it actually to develop redundancy in the human system so that they can perform any task? And I think we've tended to lose sight of that and follow the industry, the fitness industry and the sporting industry a little bit too much, and forgotten that we are a specialist industry and we need what we call warrior science. I love that term that's being bandied around at the moment. Warrior science, science specific for this population, not science that's designed for fitness enthusiasts, not science that's designed for sporting teams, but science that is designed for this population, using this population. So empowering those that serve at the moment to get research background so that they can do it in their context. So ultimately, extreme conditioning programs, my mindset is it's a tool, like any tool. If it's the only tool you have, well, then you're very, very limited. I wasn't going to put the hammer and the nail.
Yeah, everything becomes a hammer, right?
That's right.
You know, here in the States, I mean, there was a huge problem with the extreme conditioning programs. And I think, you know, the professionals out there, such as yourself, Dr. J. Dawes, you know, myself, they're getting a better grasp of it, because I think within that population, this tactical setting, like you said, there's this commitment to serve, and you have this A-type personality, and they start to base all their workouts on how you feel. You know, if it was hard, then it must be good for me. And what that really is creating is some serious issues like you just described in terms of musculoskeletal injuries, low back. But really, you can't put everybody on the same baseline. I mean, everybody's going to be at different levels, and especially within the academy setting, if you come at it from that point of view without preparing them properly, you know, you're just expecting, you know, a lot of problems. And so that's one of the areas that really needs to be addressed still to this day, because a lot of the law, especially on the tactical side, that A-type personality, go, go, go. And if the workout was hard, then I'm good.
Yeah, indeed. If your nose isn't bleeding, it wasn't a hard enough session. But the problem with that is we like to train our strengths. We don't like to train our weaknesses. And if you actually look at some of the positions that shooters get into, that firefighters get into, they're not your standard deep squat position, that angle, they're reaching around corners, which means those movement patterns are the ones that we need to train. You know, the flexibility in the system so that you can put your body in strange, unwieldy positions is very, very important, as is, you know, your basic brute strength, that they all play a part. But the problem is we focus on one so much because it looks good. You love the sound of iron clanging. I can lift 2-part cars. That's fantastic. However, I can't lean to, you know, put a lot of load on my right leg and lean around the corner because I've got no lateral trunk flexibility. You know, it's a great tool. There is a place for it, but it's not the only tool. And that's, I think, the concern that we forget. Everything's nosebleed. Well, not really.
I like to actually, yeah, and that is actually a really great point. You know, the one thing I always like what Mick always said at New South Wales Police was, you know, the stronger you are, the harder you are to break. And so we started to build on that idea of, you know what, my goal is to get you strong enough so you can actually do, I guess, poor movement patterns, which are going to occur on the job anyway, especially under load. You're not going to be perfect. So I got to make sure that you're strong enough to be able to be resilient or resist all that bad or awkward moving. Indeed.
And likewise, when you develop the strength, you need to develop this strength across multiple platforms. So many people are very strong at a deadlift or a squat with their feet in a set position. As soon as you change that foot position, their redundancy starts to degrade. So rather than always just lifting a big, heavy, you know, doing a big, heavy squat with a set position, change your foot position all the time. Some of the techniques we're using are what we call the squat step, step, or the deadlift step, step. So after every repetition, you change your foot position just slightly to build that redundancy into the system. The more redundancy you have, the more strength you have, the less potential for injury you will have.
That is actually awesome. I'm going to take that from you. I like that idea of changing the stance in between. You know, for our listeners, the one area, if this doesn't make sense, really give a police officer, military, or a firefighter a split, kneeling, chop, or lift. They always fall over.
Yeah.
They always find it to be the most odd exercise. And I'm like, but that is actually more specific to you, and you can't even move, 10 pounds of pressure on the Kaiser machine. Exactly. The chops and the lifts, that just shows you that as you were saying, the different vector angles and the different levels that they don't have. And that's what needs to be addressed.
Indeed, and the complexity of the movement, synergy, getting multiple muscle groups to work together and transfer force up and down your kinetic chain. That is vital because that's what they do in everyday life. If you just train your standard compound movement, you're going to fall short because their movement isn't compound, it's complex. Often they're moving across all 6 degrees of freedom. And yet when we train with heavy weight, we'll only move across 2 degrees of freedom, which limits our capability.
All right, so now we're going to go into the hot topic of the year. It's the one thing that everybody always wants to talk about here in the States especially, and it's creating a hornet's nest everywhere you go. There doesn't seem to be a defined answer. I think it's more of an evolution or a process of different parties to make it work. But employment standards, entry-level standards, and actually in-service standards. Give us your idea of what you've learned over the years because you've done a lot of work in this area. And take our listeners through, pros and cons of what you've learned.
Sure. So I guess the first question I always ask when I get approached by agencies about their fitness standards and testing is, what is the intent? Why are you doing this fitness standard? And I think quite often that is why there are a lot of instances where I get asked to provide evidence to either refute or to support different fitness assessments is because there's a lack of understanding about the aim of the fitness assessment. And contrary to what people think, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. You need to have a very specific idea on what you're trying to assess and why you're trying to assess it. So there's 3 different areas that we typically develop fitness assessments for. The first one is prediction of injury. So if this person undergoes this form of training at the moment, what's their risk of injury? And can we prevent them from being injured? The second one is their health and well-being. Because you've got to remember, unlike sport, we're talking about, this is an occupational lifestyle. So we want to make sure they maintain health and well-being. We know that police officers, for example, are 2 to 3 times more likely to die from a cardiovascular incident. So how do we maintain their health? And then finally, it's, well, can they perform their job? Can they perform the job task? Now, with those things come a variety of different factors. If we're looking at health and measures of health, we need to consider age and gender because we know that there are different physiological parameters between males and females and as you age. So we need to take those into account, because we're measuring the health against the general population. What we have found is for occupational tasks, it needs to be age, gender, sex, hair color, whatever, neutral. Because ultimately, if I can put into a firefighter analogy, if you need a 5-foot ladder, or I use meters, so I don't know how, that's a 5-meter ladder, that's about 10 foot, isn't it? If you need a 5-meter or 10-foot ladder to get onto a first-story building as a standard occupational task, we can't turn around and say, well, I'm sorry, you're female or you're old or you have blue eyes. Here's a 3-foot ladder, because you won't be able to achieve the task. So if it comes down to the ability to achieve a task, it is age, gender, and any other parameter neutral. For example, we're looking at our part-time personnel versus our full-time personnel. And there's an argument that the part-time personnel don't need to perform to the same level, but the counter argument is, well, they do the exact same job. So regardless of the fact they may have less chronic conditioning, we're not changing their required task. So if they have to pick up a 20-kilogram artillery shell, a 20-kilogram artillery shell doesn't matter whether you're part-time or full-time. It's the same shell that you need to pick up. Therefore, that is the occupational task. So a lot of people focus on the gender side of this at the moment, or realistically, not the gender, the sex side of this at the moment. But there's also the same parameters apply for age, the same parameters apply for whether you're part-time or full-time. So it really should be a neutral task. Can you perform it? Yes or no? If not, can we train you to perform it? Yes or no? If you can't perform it safely, then that is not the task for you. Otherwise, we are breaching our duty of care. If I knew there was a young female we're going to put a load on her back that would be 100% her body weight, and if she can't complete a march at X distance over X time, which has been correlated to the ability of soldiers to perform long distance patrols, then I'm at risk of injuring that person, and I'm aware that I'm placing that person at extreme risk. Therefore, it is my duty of care not to allow them to undertake that task. I could say the same for a police officer, regardless of who they are. If they are less than healthy for their general population, so if their health isn't the same as the general population, I'd be remiss to place them into an occupation where we know they're 2 times more likely than the general population to die of a cardiovascular incident. That would be a breach of duty of care. So I think the key things are why you're doing the testing, and then what is your duty of care? And you start to play with that legally defensible versus what I call morally defensible. So yes, we may legally not be able to defend the fact that we have these standards, but morally, I'm putting you at risk, and I know I'm putting you at risk. Shouldn't I be doing something about that?
That's actually a very valid point in terms of the legal and the moral side of it. It's a conflict that most, I think, tactical facilitators deal with. I mean, morally, yeah, they have a right to earn a living, but at the same time, the challenge is how do you get them to actually want to do it instead of need to do it? Legally is a whole nother battle into itself. And that kind of brings me to my next question that always kind of stuck in my head since day one. What about the idea of having, we have in-service for people who are on the job, and then we have employment standards for people who are coming onto the job. Are they going to be the same, or will it change over the course of their career?
And that's a great standard. Again, that's why are we doing the test? What is the aim of this test? So if the test is, for example, our ability to train them to meet a standard, remember when they join, they unless it's a very basic physical movement, physical strength parameter that we know, we need to train. That's why you do training. We need to train them to be able to perform as operators. Otherwise, they just come in as operators in the first place. So the standard quite often may be lower than that you require on the job. Conversely, once they're on the job, they may change. The nature of their job may change with different environments. So whether they are more going to more of an analytical role or boots on the ground role, or as they progress in rank. So again, those factors do need to be considered. Does every rank need to be able to perform this task? If so, do you drill it down to what we call a basic standard, so like a soldier first? No matter what rank you are, at the end of the day, you need to be able to pick up a weapon, employ your weapon safely, and perform these tasks.
Yeah.
And you may have levels depending on where they go. So an infantry soldier may be required to lift more or carry longer than an artillery officer who may be required just to lift more for a shorter period, but more quickly. So you can have those subdivisions in there, but you can have as well a baseline of what you expect. So it comes down to, why are you doing this test?
Yeah, that's really good that you actually addressed that, because I remember years ago, one of the concerns within the rank and file was, well, I'm a battalion chief. I don't throw ladders anymore. So why should I have to do these, baseline testings anymore? And that always stuck in my head, because if you do have your baseline, they actually had a valid point. There is a certain baseline, but what happens over the course of their career? What if they do promote to a battalion chief and they're no longer doing that, but actually doing a more of an administrative role? That kind of threw a little wrench into, the whole idea of, hey, we need to have employment standards, which for me at that time was beyond my scope. I didn't have the knowledge base to even attempt to do it. But I think that's where where it should actually go as we evolve this idea of employment standards. Why can't we have, a baseline with this idea of letting it evolve as you progress throughout your career?
Indeed, I agree. So the Australian Defence Science and Technology Group, they developed the PESA, the Physical Employment Standards for Army, and the team did an amazing job over a very protracted time, and they were very meticulous and thorough. And they do have a baseline standard, and then depending on which corps you go to, varying standards to meet the occupational demands of that specific corps. So as you can see, that they have already taken that concept and applied it. At the moment, they haven't really had to change rank around too much, because we have that concept of soldier first. So no matter what rank you are, you're always a soldier. Therefore, you need to be able to perform this basic skill. And this basic skill level is across all personnel. Same as weapon training. Soldier first, everyone must pass their weapons. So they've taken that mindset and thought of the soldier as the physical platform. Because ultimately, if the soldier isn't fit and capable, your weapon's not going to work. They're not going to be able to pull the trigger, because they're going to be in hospital, or they're going to be undergoing treatment and not on deployment. So the soldier first approach is very forward thinking, and it's fantastic when you apply that physical framework to support that soldier.
One of the things that keeps coming up here in the States, and hopefully not in Australia, but one of the things I keep seeing, is the idea of having an employment standard. But they constantly are getting knocked down in the court of law. And what scares me is that it's actually going to do more harm than good if we keep losing these battles in the court. Because really, we're such a litigious society. Like, everything's a sue world. Even if you could pass the test, people are going to challenge it sometimes just because. You know, what I'm fearful of, and we've seen it in Colorado, I've actually seen it with FDNY, you know, this idea of, hey, we have this valid employment standard, we've certified it and we got it, but all we need is one person to sue and challenge it. You know, what are your feelings about that? Because I'm like starting to go, hey, this actually could be more harmful than good, because if people start losing or even sue or take it to the court, most departments are going to be like, no more health and wellness programs. We don't need this. Like, this is just too much of a headache.
Indeed. And I think one of the key things there is, there's two key points. The first one is you need the science behind your test. You need to be able to justify, if say you have 25 push-ups, well, why 25? Why not 24? Why not 26? Where's your science behind the 25 or the standard that you set? So that's the first one. The second one is you need to educate everyone that's involved, that does the test, that is serving in the population, and that is going to come up and do the test. This is the test you will be doing. These are the reasons behind the test you'll be doing it, and this is where the evidence comes from for these tests. As I said, quite often it's more of a case of they don't know. They don't know why this test, why 24 and why not 25. Even the people serving who have done the test don't understand why it exists. And therefore, with the confusion, people will start to say, well, that young lady only had to do 15 to get in. I had to do 25. I was able to do 24. She did 15 and got in. I did 24 out of 25. I failed. We both did the same job. Yes, but the test wasn't about whether you did the same job. It was about whether you were as healthy as your age and gender appropriate equivalents in the civilian industry, because we know that we're going to put you under more stress. If you're not at least at the level of the fitness in the civilian industry, or the civilian population, then we are at a duty of care of injuring you. So again, that understanding of why they're doing it. Each test should be very, very well and clearly articulated, and of course have the underpinning science.
You know, the education component I think is really valid. My recommendation to a lot of departments who are starting to implement this idea of employment standards or fitness standards, I always say, you know what, to overcome a lot of the fears and obstacles, it's best to start off with a voluntary system, let the professional educate and overcome their fears. And over time, maybe in year 2 or 3, it will actually become the standard. If you force them to do it right away, you're probably going to get a lot of pushback just because. And that's kind of what we started to see here. I was recently involved a couple of years ago with a fire department where they took what we call the STAR drill, which was actually more task-oriented versus fitness-related. And the chief proceeded to say, this gentleman's unfit for duty because he couldn't tie the knots at the end of it because he was winded. My recommendation to that chief was be very careful with that, because that is not a fitness test of tying knots. That could just be a skill test. Many firefighters haven't tied knots in 10 years. And he did not take my advice. They put him on leave, and he sued and won. The firefighter won. But it sent disruptions through the department like a hurricane. And what the biggest mistake we're starting to see here in the States is there is a difference between task-specific jobs and fitness. You know, could you actually explain it, basically kind of clarify for us a little bit on that? A lot of times people go, hey, I run 1.5 miles, so I'm fit for duty. No, you just have a good heart. Now we have to apply it to job-specific tasks.
Indeed. So you've really got two parameters out there. You've got, in the occupational space, they require fitness for the occupation, but they also require often skills. So skills are something that may or may not be able to be taught. I mean, you may be able to teach somebody how to handle a weapon safely, but then again, they may just never be able to put a round on target accurately. They may not have that skill no matter how much you teach them. So yeah, you're right. One thing is purely skill-based, and one is very physically based. Quite often they are complementary. So if they don't have a good physical platform, there is no way they're going to be able to shoot accurately if they're puffing and panting and can't even hold the weapon up because they don't have enough shoulder strength or finger strength to pull the trigger. So you do require both. The question is then, so what tasks are we looking at and what physical parameters do we require for that task? But at the same time, what skill set do we require for that task? And how do they coalesce? So can they perform or learn the skills until they have, when they don't have that fitness standard or that strength? Or do we have to develop that strength and then add the skill on top of it? So it's like if we need somebody to pick up an artillery shell, put it into a breech, close the breech and then, yank the cord and send it down range. So there may be a specific skill on how to close the breech. But if they can't even squat to pick up the shell, well, then there's no point in teaching them how to close the breech because they can't even get the shell in there in the first place. So there are sometimes there is this chicken before the egg sort of thing, but that needs to be carefully considered and drilled down, because you can't say this person doesn't have the skill to fire a weapon if they don't have the hand strength in the first place. But if you can train the hand strength, then you can train the skill. Conversely, you may train the hand strength and never have the skill. So there are two competing yet conflicting requirements of tactical personnel.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, really important for people to understand, especially I know here in the States it's constantly happening. They do some type of skill-related task, which actually could be, obviously it's going to be physically demanding and it's going to be taxing to the body. But to say, hey, he's unfit for duty because he couldn't tie knots, I'm kind of like, well, be careful with that. That's not a good example to use there, Chief. And unfortunately, the department lost and the firefighter did win because he was correct. But on the flip side of that, it was a wake-up call to the firefighter to get himself into better shape.
To be honest, what I probably would have done is if he had failed it, I probably would have just let him come back fresh and just done the not tying task. So just distinguish between the physical and the skill, and then see if he actually had the skill. Was he just so tough that he couldn't concentrate, or did he not remember how to tie the knot?
Yeah, I gave him all kind. I think it was more of a personal vendetta, but that's a whole nother topic.
So you can't beat that.
So what would you give a new young tactical facilitator or someone coming into this industry? 10 years ago, I remember coming across Mick and yourself, and there really wasn't much information. And I remember just sharing ideas with other people, and we're kind of just going blind into this whole thing. And so what would you give a new young coach coming into this industry? What kind of advice would you give them?
The first bit of advice I'd get is be quiet and listen. Yeah, I mean, I know they'll have a lot of good information to share, but the problem is you need to realize the context. And if you don't understand the people you're working with, what drives them, what motivates them, the pressures they face, then all you're going to be doing is blowing into the wind. And the best way to develop that respect and rapport with them is sometimes just to not go in there and think you know everything, and just step back and listen. And believe it or not, you learn so much just by listening to this population. Every day that I'm working with these guys, I learn something. I learn about something that may be a trigger, something that may be a barrier, a way of getting around a problem. I mean, it's fantastic. We've had people come around and go, well, yeah, I had that problem, but this is how I went about it. And I went, damn, I could use that with this population. So I think being like many of them are, they may be very extroverted, but inside, because of the nature of who they are, trying to serve their community, they are often very, very humble. They're very good at making a noise, but not necessarily blowing their own horn. And there's a difference. There's a subtle difference between the two. And I think being humble and actually taking the same sort of mindset. Well, they're here to serve the community. I'm here to serve you. Saving the saviors, protecting the protectors. That's the philosophy we try to instill, because you've got to be giving of yourself, because that's what these people are. That's what these people know. And the last thing they have, because they're so time poor, is people who go in there and try to make a noise. Seagulls. They fly in, shit on everything, and then fly off. But they don't have time or temperament for that.
Well, I ain't gonna lie, you gave me goosebumps, because I can't agree with you more. I mean, it is so true. If you spend time with a tactical operator, they'll give you the answer. You just have to listen for it. And I still myself get those aha moments where I'm like, oh, didn't see that, or wow, that's interesting. This phrase keeps coming up, and that's interesting. And so they'll give you answers, and they'll tell you things about them, and you as a coach, you can pick and start to go, wow, I didn't see that coming.
Indeed. So yeah, just listen, and understand the reasoning. Why are you doing this? So quite often it'll be, why are you doing this extreme conditioning program? It's not, oh, this is bad for you. Well, why are you doing this? Well, because I need a challenge in my workout. Okay, well, how about we do this one-legged lunge where we're leaning over to the side at 90 degrees and you're holding your weapon parallel to the ground for 30 seconds. How about doing a single leg pistol squat? Yeah, that's a challenge. Suddenly they're loving it. I don't know how many guys I've taken and started doing yoga with them.
Mm-hmm.
Yoga? I'm not doing yoga. And then they come up to me afterwards and go, downward dog. She kept saying relax. It's supposed to be relaxing. I'm shaking. I'm about to fall on my head. I'm as flexible as a brick. And you go, well, this is the weakness. What do you do with weaknesses? You train them. Yep. Otherwise, that is where your body breaks. So quite often, you need to understand the reason behind doing things. It's not just what they're doing. And the only way you find that out is to listen and be engaged with them.
Listening is key. It is so key. And then just spending time with them and listening is it. So if somebody wanted to get a hold of you, Rob, what would be the best way to contact you? Where can they find some more information from Bond University?
Sure. We have the Tactical Research Unit website up on Bond University. So just type in Tactical Research Unit Bond University and you'll find us.
Well, I do appreciate you taking the time, buddy, to talk to us today. I can't thank you enough. I even got a ton of notes here for myself, to be honest with you. I like how you simplified everything and put it into categories or lists that makes it actually very easy to understand.
Thanks for having me. And as usual, as you said, you just learned something, so have I. You always see me hiding in the back of your sessions because I always love different, unique aspects. And I think that's the one thing I'd finish off with. Learn from everybody who's involved in situations. Learn from other tactical operators, other presenters who work in those populations, because you'll get these little nuggets, these 1%ers that when you line up are huge. So thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Well, Rob, I do appreciate it. And for our listeners, that's Dr. Rob Orr, the Associate Professor in Tactical Research Unit at Bond University. Rob, I wish you all the best, buddy, and take care down there in Australia. Give everybody my best.
Thank you. You take care. I'll see you soon.
Take care, buddy. Bye.